Hey, what's up guys, my name is Asian Psycho, aka Touhou Sniper 98, and it's been almost exactly 6 months since the last one of these, so for those of you who've been waiting around for the next video of this series to come out, thanks a lot for your patience. Hopefully the next one on Phantasmagoria of Flower View won't take as long. Anyways, for those of you who are newer to this series, Touhou Grand Order is a fan-made concept that I came up with last year to create FGO servant profiles out of Touhou characters, and I've made 2 of these videos already, one on Embodiment of Scarlet Devil and another on Person Cherry Blossom, so if you missed those, do check those out first, and then come back to watch this one. Again, the same usual disclaimers apply. These servant profiles are fan-made and thus potentially very broken, and they're based as much as possible on actual game lore and information taken from ntouhouwiki.net. And when there's not enough lore to work with, I just go off concepts and ideas from the general fandom, or even just make up my own for the purposes of these videos. And with all that said, let's start with the first Imperishable Knight character, Wriggle Nightbug. Wriggle is a 1-star assassin with your typical 3Q assassin deck. Her first skill is Information Erasure Self A, which removes her own debuffs, grants herself debuff immunity for 3 times for 5 turns, and increases her own star generation rate for 3 turns from 30 to 50%, all on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. I base this skill off Wriggle's lore that as an insect, she discards information that she no longer needs. So in the context of this video, I decided to give her a debuff removal and debuff immunity. And because she's an assassin, I decided to give her a star gen buff as well. Her second skill is Firefly Summoning A+, which generates a large amount of crit stars from 10 to 30, and generates another 20 crit stars if Wriggle is in forest or field battlefields. It also increases one ally's star weight for 1 turn between 1000 to 3000%, and increases that same ally's crit damage for 1 turn from 20 to 30%, all this on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. I base this skill off Wriggle's ability to manipulate and summon insects, and because she herself is a firefly, I thought it would be only natural for her to be able to summon a swarm of fireflies to come help out one of her allies, including herself. Her third skill is Insect Summoning EX, which is a pretty loaded skill. It first grants all allies 1-hit evade, but then gives herself another hit of evasion, and then buffs her own quick performance by 20 to 30% if she's in forest or field battlefields. It then decreases all enemies' attack for 3 attacks by 10 to 20%, decreases their crit chance for 3 attacks by 20 to 30%, and lowers their defense by 10 to 20% for 3 hits, all this on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. This again is based off her ability to control and summon insects, and I like to think that when she uses the skill, she's summoning so many insects that it's both hindering the enemy's ability to attack and hides your team. Also, Wriggle's second and third skills have conditional effects if she's in forest or field maps, and I think this makes sense because it's naturally easier to find large numbers of insects in maps like these. Her passive skills are Presence Concealment B, which increases her own star generation rate by 8%, and Insect Essence A, which increases her own debuff success chance by 20%, grants herself immunity to poison debuffs, but receives double damage from burn debuffs as a demerit. Her MP is Swarm Under the Moon, which is a quick AoE MP that first increases her own quick performance by 30%, then deals between 600 to 1000% damage, and then inflicts poison onto all enemies for 5 turns between 1000 and 3000 poison damage per turn. Her Bond CE is Grave of the Fireflies, which first increases her own MP damage by 30%, increases the number of stars generated with her second skill by 10, and increases the number of evasion hits in her third skill by 1, so that now her allies get 2-hit evasion if she has it equipped and is on the field. I designed Wriggle to be a solid support assassin who has both good star generating capabilities and some strong utility as both a consistent debuffer and powerful 1-turn crit support. In FGO, in order to stand out as an assassin, you can't just concentrate on star generation. Having other avenues of utility greatly improves your meta viability. So, in exchange for having only 1-star stats, I gave Wriggle some strong utility options with the bonus of being able to perform even better on forest or field maps. Next is Yukiko's favorite midnight snack, Mystia Lorelei. She's a 2-star caster with a 2Q2A deck. Her first skill is Lorelei EX, which has an initial chance to stun all enemies for 1 turn from 40 to 80%. If this initial stun misses, this skill then places fear on any enemy who didn't get stunned that lasts for 3 turns, but this fear effect does not get applied if the enemies actually resisted the initial stun effect. Fear has a 40 to 60% chance of activating stun each turn that it's active. And finally, the skill decreases enemy attack for 3 turns from 10 to 20%, and everything on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. I base this skill off Mystia's ability to induce madness through her singing, and according to ntohowiki.net, it seems like Mystia can seriously screw with people's senses with her singing, hence the heavy stun effects. Her second skill is Song of the Night Sparrow A, which grants all allies 1 turn evasion, increases all allies crit damage for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, and then reduces all enemies crit chance for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, all on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. I base this skill off Mystia's other ability to inflict blindness in people. Technically, it's not actual blindness that she's causing, she's just making ambient darkness so dark that you can't see anything around you beyond a certain point, kinda like fog. The skill is only supposed to work during the daytime though, since it's completely useless during the day, but for the sake of gameplay, I'm just pretending that it works whenever. Her third skill is Small Beast Summoning Winged EX, which increases parties' attack by 10 to 20% for 3 turns, then further increases parties' dominant command card damage for 3 turns by 20 to 30%, and when I say dominant card type, I'm referring to each servant's MP card type, and then charges parties' MP gauges by 20 to 30%, all on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. This is based off Mystia's final ability that lets her control any small winged animal, which also includes flying insects. This also features a unique mechanic of buffing specific command cards for individual servants, based off which their, like I said, dominant command card type is, which I think would give Mystia's support abilities a strong edge. Her passive skills are Territory Creation C, which increases her own arts performance by 6%, Item Construction C, which increases her own debuff success rate by 6%, and Grilled Lamprey Seller B, which increases her own healing power by 17%. Her MP is Night Blindness, which is an arts AoE support MP that decreases enemies' debuff resist by 30% for 5 turns first, and then debuffs enemy attack and defense for 1 turn by 30 to 50%, and then recovers the party's HP by 2,000 to 4,000. Her Bond CE is A Little Nighttime Song, which increases party's HP received by 20% and the party's MP generation rate by 20%. I designed Mystia to be a hybrid staller and damage buffer who's got incredible flexibility thanks to her third skill. The one flaw that I can see with this is that she has no way of making sure that her allies can take advantage of the crit buff that she gives, since she doesn't have anything in her kit that helps her with burst star gen. But other than that, I'd say she's pretty broken as a 2-star caster, and that DW will never hire me to do any sort of character creation for their game. Next is Kamishirasawa Keine, who is both a 3-star caster and a 3-star berserker. She's got a triple arts deck as a caster, but it changes to a triple buster deck when she changes to berserker. Her first skill is Hakutaku Transformation A, which changes her class to Berserker and grants herself a permanent attack buff that scales from 20 to 30% that can also be removed when switching from caster, and changes her class back to caster, removes the permanent attack buff if it hasn't been removed already, and heals her from 2000 to 3000 HP when switching from Berserker on a 5 to 3 turn cooldown. Due to her transforming nature, I decided to use Jekyll and Hyde as an inspiration for Kaine's servant design, but Jekyll and Hyde as a servant have a lot of flaws that make them a pretty mediocre servant overall, so I'm trying to avoid those same problems first by tethering their transformation mechanic to a low cooldown skill rather than their MP. This means that Keine is much more flexible and can adapt much better to battlefield conditions as they change over the course of a fight. Her second skill is Guardian of History EX, which is only usable by caster Keine. It grants party invulnerability for 1 turn except herself, increases her own defense for 1 turn by 30 to 50%, and then further increases the party's defense for 3 turns by 20 to 30%, all this on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. Also, her second skill is Creator of History EX. This is available to Berserker Keine only. This grants party one-hit evasion that cannot be pierced, increases her own buster performance by 10 to 20% for 3 turns, and then further increases the party's buster performance for 3 turns, excluding herself though, by 20 to 30%, all on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. As you can see, the second wave that I've gone about making sure that Kaine's servant design would work is to give Caster Kaine and Berserker Kaine their own skill sets, with the exception of their first skills, which is their transformation, obviously. Also of note, their skill sets are independent of each other, which means that if you wanted to, you can use Caster Kaine's second skill, transform, and then use Berserker Kaine's second skill, and all the effects would stack because Invul protects evasion stacks. Her third skill is Protection of Humans A+, which is available to Caster Kaine only. This applies Self-Taunt for 3 turns and charges party MP gauges by 10 to 20%, all on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. Also her third skill is Protection of Humans Hakutaku A+, which is available to Berserker Kaine only. This increases star weight of her own buster cards for 1 turn by 3000 to 6000% and increases her own crit damage for 1 turn from 20 to 30% on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. Her 2 passive skills are Territory Creation EX, which increases her own arts performance by 12%, which only applies when she's in caster form, and Man Enhancement C, which increases her own buster performance by 6%, which only applies when she's a berserker. Her MP as a caster is The Legend of Gensokyo, which is an arts AoE support MP that clears party debuffs, grants party debuff immunity 3 times for 5 turns, and increases party arts and buster performances by 30 to 50% for 3 attacks for 5 turns. It also charges party MP gauges by 10 to 30%. Her MP as a berserker is New History of Fantasy, which is a single target buster MP that first increases her own MP damage by 20% and grants herself Invul Pierce, then deals 600 to 1000% damage. Then it increases the party's MP damages for 1 time for 3 turns, including herself, by 10 to 30%, though this applies after she's done the damage. Her Bond CE is the Human Village's History School, which increases party's arts and buster performances by 10% when she's got this equipped and is on the field. Like I said, I drew inspiration from Jekyll and Hyde for Kaine's servant design. I think that a transformation servant who can actively switch classes mid-combat would be a very cool concept, but since Jekyll and Hyde clearly didn't turn out to be all that great, I think DW is scared of experimenting more with this concept. I think that Kaine being able to transform at will using a skill rather than her MP, and having 2 different skill sets and noble phantasms that complement their respective classes is a step in the right direction in having a good transformation type servant in FGO. Next up we have Inaba Tewi, who is a 3-star caster with a 2Q 2A deck. Her first skill is Fortune of the White Rabbit EX, which increases party buff success and debuff success chances for 3 turns by 50 to 80% and increases party star gen for 3 turns by 10 to 30%, all on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. I based this skill off Tewi's reputation among humans in Gensokyo as the Rabbit of Good Fortune, and because I wanted this to be the defining factor of this skill, I made the buff and debuff success chances really high so that at max rank, any buff or debuff that's RNG based in FGO should be more or less a guaranteed application. Her second skill is Yokai Enlightenment EX, which grants herself Guts for 1 time that has no limit and revives her of 1 HP, recovers her HP from 1000 to 3000 HP, and generates between 5 to 15 crit stars every turn for 3 turns, all on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. This skill is based off Tewi's lore of having become a yokai rabbit after living for so long, so I figured it'd be appropriate to give her a dedicated survival skill with a bit of crit star production to complement her party star gen buff. And her third skill is Con Artist B+, which applies target focus onto 1 ally for 1 turn, increases their attack by 30 to 50% for 1 turn, and grants them defense down infliction with normal attacks for 1 turn on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. The defense down stacks last for 3 turns and they scale from 0 to 10%. Everyone who's familiar with Tewi as a character in Touhou should know that she's a well-known prankster, so giving her a skill that lets her apply a taunt to someone on her team feels quite natural. Her passives are Territory Creation A, which increases her own arts performance by 10%, and Item Construction C, which increases her own debuff success rate by 6%. And her MP is Ancient Duper, which is a support arts MP that doubles the current amount of crit stars generated on the same turn for the next turn, reduces enemy accuracy, which causes all enemies to now have a chance to miss their attacks for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, and extends the party's currently applied buffs for another turn. When enemies miss their attacks do not give their targets MP charge. Her MP also reduces all enemies' attack, crit chance, and crit damage by 10 to 30% for 3 turns. And her Bond CE is the Bamboo Forest, which increases party debuff resist by 20% and party star gen by 20%. I designed Tewi to clearly be a crit star support caster with a few gimmicks up her sleeve, so to speak. She has the unique mechanic of being able to lower enemy accuracy, which is not yet a mechanic in FGO as far as I'm aware. She's got ways to really mess with the enemy team with either her own debuffs or debuffs from her teammates that she enables with the first skill, and she's got ways to provide big burst star gen for the party when necessary. Definitely not an orthodox caster in FGO, but I think she's got some strong utilities here that people could find great uses for. Next up is everyone's favorite Touhou rabbit, Inaba Udongein Reisen. She's a 4-star archer with a 2A 2B deck. Her first skill is Mystic Eyes of Insanity Skill EX, which increases her own buster performance for 3 turns by 20 to 40%, decreases enemies' debuff resistance for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, and blocks enemy MP gain completely for 1 turn on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. I'm going to be borrowing rather heavily from Fujinon's skill set here because I, being your typical novice type Moon fan, or in other words, a filthy casual, feel like she and Reisen have ocular powers that are pretty similar to each other. But because Reisen's eyes cause psychological disruption compared to Fujinon's physical distortions, I gave Reisen's skill the debuff resist debuff and MP gain denial effects instead. Her second skill is Suspicious Medicine ANT EX, which activates one of the following effects on command. It increases target allies' attack by 30 to 50% for 1 turn, it increases target allies' defense by 50 to 70% for 1 turn, or it recovers their HP between 3,000 to 6,000 on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. If Reisen uses this skill on herself, however, she also receives Guts for 1 time for 3 turns, and she revives with 1 HP. I base this skill off the one that Ilya has, but because this medicine is made by Eirin, who you all know is Touhou Project's resident pharmacist, whose predominant ability is to be able to make literally any drug, there's no RNG attached to it. And the reason why Reisen is able to apply Guts to herself when she uses this skill on herself is because she's familiar with Eirin's drugs and knows how to administer them properly to herself to get the most use out of them. Or at least that's what I like to think, and perhaps the fandom might agree with me on this one too. And her third skill is Rabbit Psychic Networking B, which charges her own MP gauge by 20 to 30%, removes her own debuffs, and increases her own crit damage for 3 turns by 20 to 30% on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. This one's based off Reisen's ability to communicate with other lunar rabbits telepathically in a sort of psychic network, since she herself originally came from the moon, and she can still do so while on Earth despite the distance between the Earth and the moon. If she were on the moon proper, however, the rank of this skill would improve drastically, and I would have been able to give her a 50% battery instead, which you all know I love gushing about in some of my other videos. Her passive skills are Magic Resistance A+, which increases her own debuff resist by 21%, Independent Action D, which increases her own crit damage by 4%, and Veteran A, which increases her arts performance by 7% and increases her own star gen by 7%. Her MP is Getsugan, Mystic Eyes of Insanity, which is a Buster AoE MP that ignores defense for 1 turn, which activates first, deals 300 to 500% damage, and reduces all enemy MP gauges by 1. It also inflicts both fear and confusion on all enemies for 5 turns, both of which have between a 40 to 60% chance of activating every turn. And finally, her Bond CE is ANT, which increases her own MP damage by 30% and gives her a 10% chance to stun a target enemy with any normal or extra attack. With her MP, however, she has a 30% chance to stun immediately, and this does not include the Fear Overcharge effect. Reisen is designed to be a hybrid DPS/utility servant since she can deal lots of damage with her buffs, control enemy MP gauges, and offers strong attack or a defense buff or a big heal, whichever you need at a specific time whenever it's available. She can also help debuff enemies so that her teammates have an easier time applying debuffs onto them if they happen happen to have high innate debuff resistances. Her one flaw is that she doesn't have her own crit star weight buff, so that she can capitalize on her crit damage, so that's something you have to look out for her. Next up is everyone's favorite Touhou nurse, Yagokoro Eirin. She's a 5-star archer with a triple arts deck. Her first skill is Medicine of Ante A+++, which increases one ally's healing received for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, cleanses their debuffs, grants them debuff immunity for 3 turns, and recovers between 2000 and 4000 HP on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. This is based off Eirin's profession as a pharmacist, since like I mentioned earlier, her main ability is to create any drug or medicine. As an archer, however, Eirin focuses less on her medical abilities and more so on her own magical and combat abilities instead, so I like to think that she carries medicine around with her that she's prepared beforehand, like she's a combat medic. Maybe she'd be stealing someone else's niche with this, actually. Her second skill is Natural Born Genius Moon EX, which grants herself gut status for 1 time for 3 turns, and revives her with between 1000 and 3000 HP, and also has an 80% chance to increase her own MP damage, her own attack, and her own defense for 3 turns, all between 20 to 30%, all on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. This skill is taken from people who have the Natural Born Genius skill, i.e. Da Vinci and Tesla, but I specifically modeled this one after Tesla's after he gets his skill buff. However, I tweaked it slightly so that it's unique to Eirin, so now instead of a guaranteed 10 to 20% attack buff that Tesla gets, Eirin can increase her attack with the same scaling as her MP and defense buffs, with the trade-off that all 3 buffs are now RNG based. And her third skill is Magecraft Moon A+++, which increases her own arts performance for 3 turns by 30 to 50% on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. This is a surprisingly very simple skill given all the skills that I've been making so far with multiple effects, but it's based on the fact that Eirin is an extremely talented magician when she's not being a pharmacist. Apparently, if she's to be believed, the shit that she pulled during Imperishable Night wasn't anywhere close to being her strongest magic, and given her background, she's probably not lying. Her passive skills are Magic Resistance EX, which increases her own debuff resistance by 25%, Independent Action A+, which increases her own crit damage by 11%, Horai Elixir EX, which charges her own MP gauge by 8% every turn, and Item Construction EX, which increases her own debuff success chance by 12%. Her MP is Imperishable Night, which is a single target arts NP that deals 900 to 1500% damage, removes their buffs afterwards, and then reduces their attacks down to 0 for 1 turn, which is a debuff that can be resisted. It also increases party arts performance by 20 to 40% for 3 turns. And her Bond CE is Self-Made Redemption, which increases her own MP damage by 30% and has a 30% chance to inflict 5% attack debuffs for 3 turns with every normal attack, which can stack. Eirin is, as you might expect, a dedicated arts archer nuke. We have archers in the game with triple arts decks like Arjuna and Dandyman, but both of them have Buster NPs, so Eirin would be the only archer in the game, if she were ever added, that is, with a pure caster deck, and you'll see why that is in just a second. She's got some utility with her first skill and her NP's effects, but with all the low cooldown skills that all give her great damage buffs, except for her first skill of course, that she can sustain, especially in an arts team, her whole goal is to just nuke anyone you want her to, and make sure that they can't survive against her for very long. Needless to say, Archer Eirin is filthy broken. Next is another Eirin servant design, but this time she's a 5-star caster with a triple arts deck. Her first skill is Pharmacist of Genso Kyo EX, which increases parties' healing received for 3 turns by 30 to 50%, cleanses their debuffs, and recovers parties' HP for every turn for 3 turns from 2000 to 3000 HP on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. As you can probably guess, Eirin's caster form focuses much more on party healing and utility, and thus her first skill focuses more on healing in exchange for the debuff immunity that her first skill had when she's in her archer class. Her second skill is Esoterica Moon EX, which increases parties' arts performance for 3 turns by 20 to 30%, charges parties' MP gauges every turn for 3 turns by 5 to 15%, and increases parties' MP generation rates for 3 turns by 20 to 30%, all on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. This skill is based on Eirin's magical ability, and according to TohuWiki.net, quote, "Esoterica are unique skills that are self-invented or understood by a limited few," end quote. And the term can be used to refer to Eirin's astronomical entombing technique, so I decided to make this skill super powerful in terms of art's utility. And her third skill is Natural Born Genius Ante EX, which grants herself gut status for one time for 3 turns, that revives her with between 1000 and 3000 HP, and has an 80% chance to increase party's MP damage, party's attack, and party's defense, all for 3 turns by 20 to 30%, all on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown, and each chance is calculated individually. As you might have been able to tell, this skill is Eirin's Natural Born Genius skill, but for the whole party instead, which very well could mean that it's one of the strongest party buff skills, even for my own little Touhou FGO thing that I've got going on here. The reason why I've decided to make all its effects buff the whole party is because, well, for one, Eirin's supposed to be a support caster, so having party buffs would be ideal, of course, but also in lore, according to Kaguya in Cajun Lunatic Runegate, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Eirin pre-exile would have never willingly become a pharmacist/doctor to humans down on Earth, and that perhaps over the hundreds of years that they spent on Earth in exile, Eirin became a lot nicer to the point where she's now Gensokyo's resident pharmacist and whatnot. So, to me anyway, it made perfect sense to turn Natural Born Genius into a party buff skill for Eirin's caster form. For her passives, she's got Territory Creation C, which increases her own arts performance by 6%, Horai Elixir EX, which charges her own MP gauge by 8% every turn, and Item Construction EX, which increases her debuff success chance by 12%. And her NP is Esoterica Astronomical Entombing, which is a support AoE arts NP that seals all enemies' MPs and skills for 1 turn, inflicts buff block on them all for 1 time each that lasts for 3 turns, and reduces their debuff resist, attack, and crit chance all for 3 turns by 30 to 50%. It also increases party's arts performance and debuff resistance for 3 turns by 30 to 50%. And finally, her Bond CE is a Busy Deya Ante, which increases party's arts performance, debuff resist, and healing received, all by 10%. It was really natural for me to create a very art support focused design for Eirin given her character and her abilities. Hopefully this doesn't mean that Taomo gets replaced by Eirin as the game's best art support caster, because that's not what I intend to do. Next up we have Houraisan Kaguya, who's a 5-star assassin with a 2Q 2A deck. Her first skill is Manipulation of Eternity EX, which grants the party invulnerability that cannot be pierced, and debuff immunity for 1 turn, but delays all incoming buffs for 1 turn and reduces the party's attack for 3 turns by 20 to 0% as demerits on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. This is based on the first of Kaguya's abilities, which is Control Eternity, and according to TohuWiki.net, the concept of Eternity rejects any and all change, hence the true invul and the debuff immunity effects. However, this also applies to friendly changes as well, so you need to be careful and put on all the buffs first that you feel like you need before using this skill. Her second skill is Manipulation of the Instantaneous EX, which increases party's quick performance, crit damage, and MP generation by 30 to 50%, all for 3 turns on an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. This is based on the second of Kaguya's abilities, which is to control the Instantaneous, as it says in the name. It's because of this ability of hers that I decided to make her a quick focused servant, and due to another reason that you might have already figured out by this point. And her third skill is Imperishable Night A+, which grants the party and all enemies Imperishable Night status for 3 turns, and grants herself Gut status for 1 time that has no limit, and revives her with between 2000 and 4000 HP on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. If the Imperishable Night status expires without being activated, it generates between 20 to 30 crit stars at the end of that turn. I wanted to include Imperishable Night somewhere in Kaguya's kit, and I thought that turning it into a conditional buff that activates with the Noble Phantasm, like Ereshkigal does or Yuiku does in my previous video, made perfect sense for it, which you'll see in just a second. Her passives are Territory Creation EX, which increases her own arts performance by 12%, and Presence Concealment Shade B, which increases her own star generation by 8% and decreases her own debuff resist by 10% as a demerit. Her MP is End of Imperishable Night, which, if the Imperishable Night status is still active, first decreases all enemies' defense by 20% for 3 turns, increases all allies' MP damages by 20% for 3 turns, and extends the party's currently applied buffs and debuffs for an additional turn, and then deals 600 to 1000% damage. It also charges the party's MP gauges by 20 to 40%. And her Bond CE is the 5 Impossible Requests, which grants herself 5-hit invulnerability and grants herself one-time guts that revives her with 5000 HP, and this stacks with the guts that she gets from the Imperishable Night. So in case you couldn't tell by now, I just had to model Kaguya's servant design after Osakabe Hime for what should be obvious reasons. Maybe if Ryo ever draws Kaguya art for FGO, they can stuff Kaguya into another Amazon delivery box too. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Fujiwara no Mokou, who's a 5-star rider with a 2A, 2B deck. Her first skill is Mana Burst Immortal Flame A++, which increases her own MP damage for 1 turn by 20 to 30%, increases her own buster damage for 3 turns by 10 to 20%, and allows her to inflict burn with her next 3 buster cards, which includes her MP, that deal 500 to 1000 burn damage every turn for 3 turns, and this skill has an 8 to 6 turn cooldown. Given Mokou's character, I've decided to make her kit very selfish and combat oriented, so giving her a type of Mana Burst seemed like a logical choice to me. But it wouldn't be a Touhou servant if I didn't give them an utterly broken version of a skill, so now Mokou has a skill that gives her both a buster buff and an MP damage buff. Speaking of utterly broken skills, her second skill is Battle Continuation Elixir A+, which grants herself gut status for 1 time and has no limit, but which revives her with 1 HP, increases her own defense by 30% for 1 turn, and then further increases her own defense for 3 turns by 20 to 30% on a 9 to 7 turn cooldown. This skill single-handedly manages to power creep both Shapeshift and Battle Continuation. Or maybe I just mashed these 2 skills together because I thought it'd be hilariously strong. Either way though, it certainly fits Mokou and her lore of going off to kill Kaguya hundreds of times in the past. And her third skill is Magecraft Elixir B+, which increases her own buster and arts performance for 1 turn by 22 to 44% and grants herself guts for 1 time for 3 turns that revives her with 1 HP and stacks with the guts that she gets from Battle Continuation all on a 7 to 5 turn cooldown. According to ntohowiki.net, Mokou has managed to learn lots of types of Magecraft over the years as an immortal, but it's clear that she's not on the same level as, say, Eirin or Kaguya, hence only the B+ rank. Why did I put an extra guts in there, you ask? Well, it's Mokou, so why not? And her passives are Magic Resistance B, which increases her own debuff resistance by 17.5%, Horai Elixir EX, which charges her own MP gauge by 8% every turn, and Riding EX, which increases her own quick performance by 12%. Her MP is Phoenix Rebirth, which is a single target buster MP that first increases her own attack by 30% for 1 turn, and then deals 6000 to 1000% damage, then inflicts burn that deals 2000 damage per turn for 5 turns. It also heals her for 3000 to 5000 HP. And her Bond CE is the Bond Only Immortals Share, which grants herself gut status 3 times, which revives her with 1 HP each time, and stacks with all of her other guts. Someone left a comment in my previous video saying something along the lines of expecting to see an unkillable Mokou or something, so I guess here you go. And by the way, make sure to go thank Angry Mango for having stackable guts, since now that means that Mokou can stack up to 5 guts all on her own, and basically stay alive for God knows how long, and that's not even mentioning all the ludicrous self-buffs I gave her on top of that. So that concludes the Imperishable Night chapter of my little Touhou Grand Order series. Hope y'all enjoyed how nice and overpowered these characters all are. Next up is, naturally, Phantasmagoria Flower View, which will probably be a bit shorter than usual since most of the cast there are returning characters, so hopefully that means that I'll be able to get around to making that video sooner rather than later, as I expressed in the beginning of this video. Anyways, thanks for watching, and until next time, deuces.